Hey YouTubers, here's a little known black history fact. Benjamin Banneker was an African-American almanac author, surveyor, land writer, and farmer who had knowledge of mathematics and natural history and had a front row seat at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Benjamin Banneker was born in 1731 and died in 1806. He was a self-educated scientist, astronomer, inventor, writer, and anti-slavery publicist. He was born in Baltimore County, Maryland, to a free African-American woman who was a former slave. Banneker had little or no education and was self-taught. He was born on November 9, 1731 in Baltimore County, Maryland. He died October 9th in 1806 in Catonsville, Maryland. Banneker's knowledge of astronomy helped him author a successfully commercial series of almanacs. He corresponded with Thomas Jefferson on the topics of slavery and racial equality. Jefferson, having earlier drafted the United States Declaration of Independence, abolitionists far and wide, and advocates of racial equality promoted and praised Banneker's work. Unfortunately, on the day of Banneker's funeral, a fire destroyed many of his papers, leaving a meager few, which is currently available for public viewing. In the surviving papers, there's little mention about his family's origin and his grandparents. A historian researched the name Banneker and found that the origin of the name Banneker originated in a small village, and people in that village are known as Banneker in Bomi County in northwestern Liberia. This particular region of Liberia once participated in the slave trade. And going back a little further, the name Banneker came from Mali. These people lived in Mali before migrating to Liberia, according to the historian, and subsequently became slaves in America. Much of Banneker's life is sketchy at best. His earlier life, because remember, most of his papers were destroyed on the day of his funeral. Whether intentional, we don't know. But his history went up in flames on the day he was buried. Most of his history, anyway. Now, there were some people who can account for his life, some part of his life. And there were some papers left behind that were not burnt, and so historians pasted together to produce a story because his story is so important. In 1737, Banneker was named at the age of 6 on the deed of his family's 100-acre farm. The farm was located in Patasco Valley in the rural Baltimore County. Early accounts are that his parents sent him to a school where he learned to read and write as a young lad. However, the remainder of Banneker's early life is not well documented. A book came out 140 years ago, whereby it was mentioned in the book that Banneker met and befriended a man whose name was Peter Henrich, who was a Quaker and who later established a school near the Banneker family farm. At that time, Quakers were leaders in the anti-slavery movement and were advocates for racial equality. This is another accounting for how Banneker became so prolific in his reading and writing abilities. These accounts stated that Heinrich shared his personal library and provided Banneker with his only classroom instruction. And his education ended when he was old enough to help his family on the family farm. Now, YouTubers, there are two stories out on Banneker. One is that he was educated at an early age and worked on a family farm later on. And the next story is he had no education, barely had an education, and was self-taught. But whatever story is true, the fact of the matter is he had a meager education and had accomplished a great deal with the little education he acquired. In 1772, three brothers moved close to the Banneker farm area. The names of the three brothers were Andrew, John, and Joseph Allicott. The Allicott brothers were Quakers who held the same views on racial equality. They opened up a mill, and the name of the mill was Grits Mills. Banneker and these three brothers were acquainted. In 1788, one of the sons of Andrew Elliot, George Elliot, loaned Banneker books and equipment to begin a more formal study of astronomy. During the following year, Banneker sent George his work containing a solar eclipse. In 1790, Banneker prepared works that he hoped would be within a published almanac. However, he was unable to find a printer that was willing to publish and distribute his work. A little sidebar, YouTubers. During the era of the almanac, and people used the almanac, everybody had the almanac. It was in every household. So if you published an almanac, that means you had knowledge of astronomy, the weather, crops, the soil, medicine, eclipses, etc. The almanac is still around today, but it's not widely used. People mostly use a regular calendar. And in today's society, if we want the weather, we look at the weather report. If we want to find out about astronomy, then we look at NASA. What is there? If we, everything is departmentalized. In early 1791, the U.S. Secretary of State at that time, Thomas Jefferson, asked the surveyor, whose name was Major Andrew Ellicott, the son of Joseph Ellicott. He asked him to survey an area that would contain a new federal district. In 1791, Ellicott left a surveying team in western New York to begin the district surveying of Washington, D.C. The reason why Thomas Jefferson employed Andrew Ellicott to survey a new site for the nation's capital was because on the day in 1790, President George Washington signed into law the Resident Act, which granted him the power to select a new site for a capital of the United States. The new site, as we know now, is along the east bank of the Potomac River. However, at the time, the federal government, the capital of the United States, was located in New York City. Because he left that team, he needed someone to help him, so he hired Banneker as a replacement to assist in the initial survey of the federal district's boundaries. So this is important, folks, because you're talking about drawing up boundaries for the nation's capital. So the territory that became the original District of Columbia, which is Washington, D.C., was formed from the land along the Potomac River that the states of Maryland and Virginia turned over to the federal government of the United States in accordance with the 1790 Federal Residence Act and later legislation. So Eliot's team, which included Banneker, placed boundary markers, stones, at or near every mile point along the borders of the new capital territory. So biographers have stated that Banneker's duties on the survey consisted primarily of making astronomical observations and calculations to establish base points, including one at Jones Point in Alexandria, Virginia, where the survey started and where the south corner stone was to be located. It is also stated that Banneker maintained a clock that he used to relate points on the ground to the position of the stars at specific times. A little sidebar about Banneker's clock. In 1752, Banneker garnished public acclaim by building a clock entirely out of wood. The clock, believed to be the first built in America, kept precise time for decades. In 1789, Banneker began making astronomical calculations that enabled him to successfully forecast a solar eclipse. Other historians noted that Banneker's role in the survey is uncertain because the documentation is meager at best. Because remember, most of his works went up in flames on the day he was buried. However, people like Thomas Jefferson vouched for his integrity. In 1791, Banneker left the surveying team of Ellicott because he wanted to devote more time to his farm and publication of his almanac, which was extremely important to him. After Banneker returned to Ellicott's mill, Banneker made astronomical calculations and predicted eclipses and planetary conjunctions for those things to be included in his almanac. So at the time that Banneker was ready to publish his almanac, one of the prominent American almanac authors took a look at his almanac and made this statement. A little sidebar here, YouTubers. Remember at the time, Banneker was looking for a publisher to publish his almanac. So he was shopping around, but no one would publish his almanac because of his skin color. David Rawtenhouse took a look at it, and according to historians said, "I have examined Benjamin Banneker's almanac for 1792 and is of the opinion that it well deserves the acceptance and encouragement of the public." He further stated that it was a very extraordinary performance considering the color of the author. And I think that was the smoking gun statement right there. If there was any doubt as to the color of Benjamin Banneker, that statement by Rittenhouse said it all. That statement proves that he was black. Rittenhouse further stated that he had no doubt that the calculations are significantly accurate for the purposes of a common almanac, and that every instance of genius amongst the Negroes is worthy of attention, because their suppressors seem to lay great stress on their supposed inferior mental abilities. So in essence, what he was saying, because the slave owners has beaten into the slaves that they are inferior mentally, that every time someone emerges out of the slavery group, the enslaved people group, that their accomplishment is worth noting. It is worth attention. So Benjamin Banneker replied to Rittenhouse, and he said, I am annoyed to find that the subject of my race is so much stressed. The work is either correct or it's not. In this case, I believe it to be perfect. So, an associate of Banneker's, whose name was Pemberton, made arrangements for Joseph Horshark to publish Banneker's almanac. Remember, he was having a difficult time finding a publisher to publish his almanac, and it was very important to him because remember, YouTubers back in those days in the 17th century, it was all about the almanac. The almanac had everything included, from how the crops are going to do, or astronomy, the weather, the date, any medicinal medicine, better, it just included everything under the sun. Most people today just use a calendar, but back in the 17th century, everyone used an almanac. So authors of the almanac were widely respected. So a printer by the name of Goddard agreed to publish and sell Benjamin Banneker's almanac. That year, at least 28 editions of the almanac, some of which appeared during the same year, were printed in 7 cities in 5 states. And the states were Baltimore, Philadelphia, Wilmington, Delaware, Alexandria, Virginia, Petersburg, Virginia, Richmond, Virginia, and Trenton, New Jersey. The almanac contained the motions of the sun and moon, the true places and aspects of the planets, the rising and setting of the sun, place and age of the moon, the luminations, conjunctions, eclipses, judgment of the weather, festivals, days for holding the Supreme Court and Circuit Courts of the United States, and also the useful courts in Philadelphia, and much more were included on the almanac. So people kind of governed their lives based on the almanac. They would look at it and decide, what the weather is going to be, or is it a good day to plant crops, or what the moon cycle is, and if there's a full moon out. So these astronomers were top dog. They were king. So the 1792 almanac also contained a table that predicted high tide at 4 locations, which included Virginia, Baltimore, Maryland, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, to name a few. So if you were a sailor or a fisherman and you went out on the boats at sea, this information was valuable. So after 1792, pretty much every year thereafter, Banneker's almanac was printed. And in 1795, the almanac contained a lengthy account of a yellow fever epidemic that had struck the city in 1793. So the accounting of the yellow fever epidemic was documented in the almanac. Some of the accounting were the origin of the yellow fever, the causes of the epidemic, as well as the extent and duration of the event. So YouTubers, you get a little glimpse and a sense of what the almanac was all about. It was the news. The 1796 almanac contained a table that had each U.S. state and the Southwest Territory as recorded in the 1790 United States Census. So Banneker's 1796 almanac concluded and gave the 1790 census result. It broke down the number of free persons and slaves in each state and the territory according to race and gender, as well as to whether they were above or below the age of 16. The almanac also listed the number of members of the U.S. House of Representatives that each state had during the publishing of the almanac. Banneker kept a series of journals that contained his notebooks for astronomical observations, his diary, and accounts of his dreams. The journals escaped the fire on the day of his funeral. Additionally, contained a number of mathematical calculations and puzzles. On August 19, 1791, after Banneker departed the federal capital area, he wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson, who in 1776 had drafted the United States Declaration of Independence, and in 1791 was serving as the United States Secretary of State. Because Banneker was African American, he rallied to the cry of slaves. And so, the letter that he wrote to Jefferson expressed a plea for justice for African Americans who were slaves at the time. To support his plea, Banneker included within his letter a handwriting manuscript of an almanac for 1792 containing his ephemeris with his astrological calculations. An ephemeris is a table or data file giving the calculated positions of a celestial object at regular intervals throughout a period. You can compute an ephemeris for any comet that is discovered and plot an accurate finder chart. He retained handwritten copies of the letter to Jefferson, and Jefferson's August 30th, 1791 reply in a volume of manuscripts that became part of our journal. In late 1792, James Angle published a Baltimore edition of Banneker's 1793 almanac that contained copies of Banneker's letter to Jefferson's reply. A little sidebar, YouTubers. So it appears to me that Banneker and Jefferson were friends. So getting back to the story. So soon afterwards, a Philadelphia printer distributed 2 sequential editions of a widely circulated pamphlet that also contained the letter and reply. The Universal Asylum paper and Columbia magazine also published Banneker's letter and Jefferson's reply in Philadelphia in late 1792. The magazine's editors titled the letter as being from the famous self-taught astronomer Benjamin Banneker, a black man. In his letter to Jefferson, Banneker accused Jefferson of criminally using fraud and violence to oppress his slaves. Jefferson's reply did not directly respond to Banneker's accusations, but instead expressed his support for the achievement of his black brethren. So Jefferson was really straddling the fence. On one hand, he had slaves. On the other hand, he was in support of abolition. And remember, history does shows that Sally Heming, who was black, had 4 children for Jefferson. Other scholars said she had more children, so this is just to prove a point. I'm deviating again from the story, but the point is, a slave does not consent to a relationship with her master. Sally Heming subsequently gave birth to several children for Jefferson, but the point being is that Jefferson, on one hand, was sleeping with a slave girl and had slaves, and on the other hand, he was in agreement with Banneker for the oppressive nature of slavery to be over. So Jefferson wrote in one of his writings to Marquis de Condorcet in France, he stated that, "I'm happy to be able to inform you that we have now in the United States a Negro, a son of a black man born in Africa, and of a black woman born in the United States, who is a very respectable mathematician. I procured him to be employed under one of our chief directors in laying out the new federal city on the Potomac, and in the intervals of his leisure, while on that work, he made an almanac for the next year, which he sent to me in his own handwriting, and which I included to you. I have seen very elegant solutions and geometrical problems by him. Add to this that he is a very worthy and respectable member of society. He is a free man. I shall be delighted to see these instances." Banneker never married for reasons that are uncleared. The 4 editions of his 1797 almanac were the last ones that printers published. On October 19, 1806, at the age of 74, Banneker died. So the takeaway of this story is there was a black man by the name of Benjamin Banneker who was self-taught and became a respected astronomer and plotted a lot of the constellations. He published a yearly almanac, and he was widely respected, so much so that he had a front row seat when the Declaration of Independence was signed, as noted on the $2 bill. YouTubers, if you look on a $2 bill, there's a black man sitting a little to the left center, not exactly to the center, but a little to the left. That is Benjamin Banneker. My takeaway is, because he was such a staunch advocate for freedom of the slaves, that it was only fitting that he was invited to be there at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So Banneker was so respected that he sat on the front row, not the back row, the front row. And so YouTubers, you get a little glimpse as to how important Banneker was. YouTubers, remember I mentioned in the beginning of the story that most of Banneker's papers were destroyed in a fire the same day he was buried. Well, in 1987, a member of the Ellicott family, which had retained Banneker's only remaining journal, donated the document and other Banneker manuscripts to the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore. The family also retained several items that Banneker had used after borrowing them from George Ellicott, as well as some that Banneker himself had. So, Ellicott family members retained some of the items. They did not donate everything to the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore. In 1996, a descendant of George Ellicott decided to sell at auction some of the other items that were in their possession. A list of some of the items included a drop leaf table, candlesticks, candle molds, maps, letters, and diaries. There was plans also for a Benjamin Banneker Historical Park and Museum in Oella, Maryland. But the items in which they wanted to set up the museum with fell into the hands of a Virginia investment banker who won most of the items through bidding, totaling $85,000. The investment banker stated that he expected to keep some of the items and he was going to donate the rest of the items to the African American Civil War Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. The Library of Congress also holds a copy of Jefferson's August 30, 1791 handwritten letter to the Marquis de Condorcet in France that described Banneker's race abilities, his almanac, and his work with Andrew Ellicott to draw up new boundaries for the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. So far, what we know about Banneker, he was self-taught and mastered a discipline that people have to go to school to learn, astronomy. And his almanacs contained information pertaining to the moon, the sun, lunar eclipses. And I do believe in today's society, someone like him would be classified as a genius. So the takeaway here is Benjamin Banneker was an African American almanac author, surveyor, landowner, and farmer who had knowledge of mathematics and natural history, who, along with Andrew Ellicott, mapped out, surveyed, and plotted the new nation's capital along the Potomac River. YouTubers, I'm over now. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel and to this video by pressing the subscribe button before you leave. Thank you.